"Please don't laugh at me," she said on a blind date. Then the single dad's reaction changed everything. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Jenna Bishop sat in her Honda Civic outside Brew and Bean Coffee Shop in South Minneapolis on a Saturday afternoon in late March, watching the clock on her dashboard tick closer to 2:30, and she was running through about 17 different exit strategies in her head, ranging from faking a work emergency to just driving home and blocking her best friend Casey's number, so she'd never have to explain why she bailed on yet another blind date. Her hands were shaking so bad she had to grip the steering wheel to make them stop, and she could already feel it happening. That tightness in her throat that meant her stutter was about to get bad. The kind of bad where she couldn't even get her own name out without repeating the first sound 4 or 5 times like a broken record nobody wanted to listen to. Here's the thing about having a stutter your entire life. You get real good at figuring out which situations are going to make it worse, and blind dates were absolutely at the top of that list, right next to public speaking and ordering coffee from baristas who looked impatient. Jenna was 32 years old and worked as an ER nurse at Hennepin County Medical Center doing 12-hour shifts that left her so exhausted she barely had energy to microwave dinner, let alone put herself through the torture of modern dating. And honestly, she'd been fine with that arrangement for the last 2 years, ever since the incident with Derek, who'd literally laughed in her face mid-sentence at a restaurant and then posted about it on social media like her speech impediment was some kind of hilarious dating fail story. She'd seen the post before he even had the decency to block her, his friends commenting with crying laughing emojis, and something in Jenna had just shut down after that, decided that being alone was safer than giving someone else ammunition to make her feel like she was less than human. But Casey had been relentless for months, saying things like, "You can't let one jerk ruin your entire love life, and I have the perfect guy. He's different, I promise." And Jenna had finally caved last Tuesday over tacos and margaritas because saying no to Casey while she was holding guacamole hostage was basically impossible. The guy's name was Gavin Reed, and all Jenna knew about him was that he was 36, ran some kind of tech startup from home, and had a 5-year-old son, which honestly made her more nervous because single dads usually had their lives together in ways that made Jenna's chaotic schedule of night shifts and frozen pizza dinners look like she was barely adulting. She checked her reflection in the rearview mirror for the 100th time, tucked a piece of dark hair behind her ear, took 3 deep breaths like her old speech therapist used to make her do before presentations, and forced herself out of the car before she could talk herself into leaving. The coffee shop was one of those local places with mismatched furniture and art from neighborhood kids taped to the walls, not fancy or intimidating, and Jenna spotted him immediately sitting at a corner table, looking just as nervous as she felt, which somehow made everything slightly less terrifying. Gavin looked up when the door chimed and smiled, stood up in that awkward way guys do when they're not sure if they should hug or handshake or just wave, and Jenna walked over feeling like her heart was trying to escape through her rib cage. "Jenna, hi, I'm Gavin. It's really good to finally meet you." And his voice was warm and genuine, and he had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. And Jenna opened her mouth to respond and felt the stutter slam into her like a wall. She could feel the word "hi" getting stuck behind her teeth, could feel her face starting to burn with embarrassment, and she made a split-second decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on how the next 5 minutes went. "I need to tell you something, and please don't laugh at me," Jenna said, and she could hear her voice shaking, could hear the stutter making the words come out jagged and uneven, and Gavin's smile shifted immediately to concern, not mockery, which was already better than she'd expected. She sat down across from him and gripped her hands together under the table so hard her knuckles went white. "I have a stutter. I've had it since I was a kid. It gets really bad when I'm nervous or emotional, or basically any time I'm not at work talking about medical stuff, and I've been laughed at before, like really humiliated. So I just need you to know that if you want to leave right now, I totally understand, and there's no hard feelings." The words tumbled out faster than she meant them to, her stutter punching holes in sentences, and she watched Gavin's face expecting to see that look. The one where people's eyes get uncomfortable and they start planning their exit. but instead he did something she absolutely wasn't prepared for. Gavin pulled his phone out of his pocket and set it on the table between them. Okay, first of all, I'm not going anywhere. Second, I want to show you something if that's okay. I asked Leo's therapist if I could share this with people because it helps them understand what he's working through. He pulled up a video and turned the phone so Jenna could see the screen. And there was a little boy with Gavin's same eyes sitting at a table with a speech therapist, trying to say the word ball, and it kept coming out wrong, his mouth forming shapes that didn't match the sounds. And the therapist was patient and encouraging, and the kid kept trying with this determined expression that made Jenna's throat get tight for completely different reasons. That's my son Leo. He has childhood apraxia of speech. It's a motor speech disorder where his brain has trouble telling his mouth how to make the sounds he wants to make, Gavin said, and his voice was full of this fierce protective love that Jenna recognized from every parent she'd ever treated in the ER. I've spent the last 5 years learning everything I possibly can about speech differences and communication disorders because I needed to help my kid navigate a world that doesn't always have patience for people who talk differently. And the biggest thing I've learned is that speech doesn't define worth. Connection isn't about perfect words. It's about showing up and being real with each other. He looked at Jenna directly, and his expression was so genuine, it made her want to cry right there in the coffee shop. My son's teaching me every single day that the best conversations aren't about saying things perfectly. They're about saying things honestly, so please take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm definitely not laughing. Jenna felt something crack open in her chest that had been sealed shut since the Derek incident, felt her shoulders drop from where they'd been tensed up around her ears, and when she spoke again, her stutter was still there, but it was softer, less violent, because the panic had drained out of her system. I work in the ER and I can talk to trauma patients and bark orders at residents without stuttering at all because it's clinical and my brain doesn't panic, but the second I'm in a personal situation, my speech just falls apart. It's been like that my whole life. Gavin nodded like he actually understood. Leo's the same way. He can sing songs almost perfectly because it uses a different part of his brain. But asking for a snack at preschool turns into this whole struggle. Speech is weird and complicated, and nobody should be judged for how their brain processes communication. They ended up talking for 3.5 hours, way past when the afternoon crowd thinned out, and the baristas started giving them looks like maybe they should order something else or leave. And Jenna told him about her job and the organized chaos of emergency medicine, about growing up with a stutter in a world that valued quick, clever comebacks, about her family in Wisconsin who loved her but never quite knew how to help. Gavin told her about building educational apps for kids with learning differences, about Leo's mom, Vanessa, who'd left when Leo was 4 months old because postpartum depression had destroyed her ability to function, and she'd signed away custody and moved to California, about learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and joining single dad support groups at the community center. Somewhere around hour 2, Jenna realized she was laughing without monitoring every word that came out of her mouth, realized her stutter had faded to background noise instead of the main event, realized this guy across from her wasn't seeing her speech impediment as a flaw that needed overlooking, but just as part of who she was. When they finally left the coffee shop, the sun was setting, and the Minneapolis sky was doing that thing where it turns pink and orange, and they stood in the parking lot, neither one of them quite ready to say goodbye yet. I know Casey probably already asked you this, but would you want to do this again? Like actually go out somewhere? Maybe meet Leo if you're comfortable with that, Gavin said, and his hands were in his pockets, and he looked hopeful in a way that made Jenna's heart do something complicated. Yeah, I'd really like that, Jenna said, and her stutter barely touched the words. This is the first time in 2 years I've actually wanted a second date, so yeah, definitely, yes. Gavin's smile was bright enough to compete with the sunset. Okay, good, because I haven't enjoyed talking to someone this much in longer than I can remember. I'll text you tonight and we'll figure out details. Jenna drove home with her windows down, even though it was barely 50 degrees, singing along to the radio without worrying about how the words came out, thinking maybe Casey had been right and maybe not. Everyone was going to see her stutter as a deal breaker. Maybe someone out there was actually capable of hearing past the broken sounds to the person underneath. 3 months into dating, Gavin Reed and Jenna Bishop had fallen into this rhythm that felt almost too good to be real, The kind of relationship where you stop waiting for the other shoe to drop and start actually believing maybe you get to keep this person. And then on a random Tuesday in June, everything shifted in a way none of them saw coming. Jenna had met Leo about 6 weeks into dating after Gavin made sure she was serious and not just someone passing through his kid's life. And that first meeting had been at the Science Museum, where Leo had grabbed her hand within 20 minutes and dragged her to the dinosaur exhibit, chattering away in his careful, deliberate way about velociraptors. Watching this 5-year-old work so hard to communicate, seeing how much effort went into every sentence he constructed, had made Jenna fall a little bit in love with both of them, right there between the T-Rex skeleton and the Triceratops display. She'd started spending weekends at Gavin's place in South Minneapolis, this 2-bedroom house with a fenced yard that desperately needed landscaping, and a kitchen that was always scattered with Leo's speech therapy worksheets and drawings of superheroes with misspelled labels. Jenna would come over after her Friday night shifts at the hospital still in scrubs, and Gavin would have coffee ready and Leah would be half asleep on the couch waiting to show her whatever new word he'd mastered that week. And it felt like family in a way that terrified Jenna as much as it filled up all the empty spaces she'd been carrying around. Her stutter had almost completely disappeared around them, like her nervous system finally understood. These were safe people who weren't keeping score of her imperfect sentences, and she caught herself thinking about futures and possibilities she'd written off years ago. That Tuesday, Jenna was at Gavin's house making grilled cheese for Leo's lunch while Gavin worked in his home office trying to fix a bug in his latest learning app, and his phone rang from the kitchen counter with a California area code that made Jenna's stomach do something uncomfortable, even though she didn't know why yet. She heard Gavin's office door open and his footsteps coming down the hall, watched him pick up the phone and check the screen, watched his entire face drain of color in a way that made her put down the spatula and mouth. "You okay?" He answered the call and walked into the backyard, and Jenna stood at the kitchen window, watching his body language get more and more tense, shoulders hunched, free hand running through his hair over and over, which was his tell for when he was seriously stressed about something. 20 minutes later, he came back inside and looked at Jenna with eyes that were doing that thing people do when they're trying not to panic. That was Vanessa, Leo's mom. She's moving back to Minnesota. She's been in therapy for 2 years. She's on medication. She wants to try being in Leo's life again. Jenna felt the bottom drop out of her stomach because this was the mom who'd left when Leo was barely 4 months old. The mom who'd signed away custody because postpartum depression had made her unable to function. The mom Leo didn't remember at all because he'd been basically a newborn when she disappeared. "What did you tell her?" Jenna asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. And Gavin sank into one of the kitchen chairs, looking like he'd been hit by a truck. "I told her I needed time to think, that I couldn't just let her waltz back in without understanding what she wants and if she's actually stable enough to not destroy him if she leaves again." Jenna sat down across from him and reached for his hand. "I work in medicine. I've seen postpartum psychosis and severe postpartum depression. It's a real illness, and people can recover with proper treatment. If she's been working on herself for 2 years, that's significant." Gavin looked at her like she'd just said something he desperately needed to hear, but was terrified to believe. "You think I should let her see him?" And Jenna squeezed his hand. "I think you should hear her out for Leo's sake. Kids deserve to know their parents tried if it's safe to try. But I also think you protect him first and foremost. Supervised visits, slow introduction, professional oversight." She was saying all the right supportive things while internally screaming, because what if Vanessa came back and Gavin decided Leo needed his biological mom? What if Jenna became the third wheel in a reconciliation she'd helped facilitate? What if she lost both of them to a woman who had biology on her side? 2 weeks later, Vanessa started supervised visits at a family counseling center twice a week with the social worker present. And Gavin had asked Jenna to come to the first one for moral support. So she sat in the waiting room while Gavin brought Leo inside to meet the stranger who was technically his mother. She could hear Leo's voice through the door getting louder and more distressed. "I don't know her, Daddy. I don't know her. I want to go home." And Jenna's heart shattered into about 17 pieces listening to this kid who'd already worked so hard just to communicate having to navigate something this emotionally complicated. When they came out 45 minutes later, Leo was clinging to Gavin's neck and wouldn't look at anyone. and Vanessa stood in the doorway of the counseling room looking devastated, and Jenna made accidental eye contact with her and saw someone who was genuinely trying, but also drowning in guilt and uncertainty. The visits continued twice a week for the next 2 months, and Leo started acting out in ways he never had before, refusing to do his speech exercises, having meltdowns at bedtime, asking Gavin questions like, "Is the lady taking me away from you?" that broke everyone's hearts. Gavin was stretched so thin trying to balance reassuring his son and giving Vanessa a fair chance, and running his business that barely had time to make payroll some months. And Jenna could see him spiraling, but didn't know how to help because she was realizing something that made her want to throw up every time she thought about it too hard. She wasn't Leo's mom, she was the girlfriend. She didn't have legal standing or biological connection. If Gavin and Vanessa decided to try co-parenting for real, then Jenna would be the outsider who'd been keeping the seat warm until the real parent showed up. She started pulling back without really meaning to, stopped staying over as much, started saying she had extra shifts at the hospital even when she didn't, stopped offering opinions about Leo's routine or his therapy schedule because it felt like overstepping boundaries she didn't have permission to cross. Her stutter came back with a vengeance, worse than it had been in months because the stress was eating her alive, and she couldn't talk to Gavin about it without sounding selfish and terrible. One night in late August, Gavin showed up at her apartment after Leo was asleep with his brother babysitting, and he looked furious in a way she'd never seen. "What's going on, Jenna? You're disappearing on me. You barely answer texts. You haven't been over in a week. If you want out, just tell me." Jenna felt tears burning behind her eyes and her stutter hit every other word. "I'm pulling back because I don't want to overstep my place in Leo's life before we truly know where we stand as a couple. What if Vanessa gets more stable and you decide Leo needs his real mom? What if I'm getting too attached to a kid who isn't mine and I don't have any right to an opinion about what happens to him?" Gavin stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You think you don't have a right to an opinion? You're at every single one of Leo's speech therapy appointments, learning his exercises. You're the one who figured out he communicates better after physical activity. You've been more of a mother to him in 3 months than biology automatically guarantees. How can you think you don't matter here?" Jenna was full-on crying now, the kind of ugly crying where you can't catch your breath. "I'm not his mom, Gavin. I'm terrified of getting too attached and then losing both of you. If Vanessa comes back for real, I can't compete with biology." Gavin crossed her tiny apartment living room and pulled her into his arms. "You're not competing with anyone. Vanessa's trying, and I respect that, but she's struggling. Leo asks for you when he's upset. He practices his words with you. You're already his person. Whether there's a legal document saying it or not, I need you to stay and help me figure this out. Please don't run because you're scared." Jenna pressed her face against his shoulder. "What if I stay and she gets better and you choose her?" And Gavin's voice was fierce. "I'm choosing you right now. I'm asking you to trust me and stay. Can you do that?" They stood there in her apartment, holding each other, while the Minneapolis summer night sounds filtered through the open window. Sirens and traffic and somebody's music playing too loud. And Jenna made a decision to stop protecting herself and start fighting for what she wanted. "Okay, I'll stay. I'll stop pulling away. But Gavin, I'm scared." And he kissed the top of her head. "Me too. But we're doing this together." 2 weeks later, Gavin got a call from the social worker supervising Vanessa's visits, asking for an emergency meeting. And when they showed up the next day, Vanessa was sitting in the counseling office with red eyes and shaking hands. And the social worker's face told them everything they needed to know before anyone said a word. Vanessa had been doing okay for 2 months, but the sustained pressure of trying to build a relationship with a child who didn't know her while managing her mental health had triggered a breakdown. And she was sitting there looking at Gavin and Jenna, knowing she had to make an impossible choice between what she wanted and what Leo actually needed. The social worker's office felt smaller than it had during previous visits. Like the walls were closing in, while Vanessa sat there with mascara streaked down her face, trying to explain to Gavin and Jenna that she'd had a breakdown 3 nights ago and ended up at urgent care with a panic attack so severe they'd kept her overnight for observation. She'd been doing everything right for 2 months, showing up to every supervised visit, taking her medication, going to therapy twice a week. But the sustained pressure of trying to build a relationship with a 5-year-old who looked at her like she was a scary stranger while managing mental health that was still fragile, had cracked something inside her that she couldn't fix with willpower alone. "I thought I could do this," Vanessa said, and her voice was shaking so hard the words barely made it out. "I thought 2 years of therapy and the right medications meant I was ready. But every visit with Leo triggers me. I see how scared he is, and I feel the guilt crushing me, and I can't breathe. My therapist says I'm not stable enough for the reality of active parenting, and I think she's right." Gavin sat there looking like he didn't know whether to feel relieved or devastated, and Jenna reached over and squeezed his hand, because this was complicated in ways that didn't have easy answers. Mental illness wasn't a moral failure, but it also didn't erase the impact on everyone involved. The social worker explained that Vanessa had made the decision to step back from visits, that she recognized continuing to push herself was going to end in either another breakdown or worse, and that she wanted to talk to Jenna privately if Jenna was willing. 20 minutes later, Jenna found herself sitting across from Vanessa at the same coffee shop where she'd met Gavin for their first date. And the irony of the location wasn't lost on her. Seemed like this place was becoming the spot where her entire life changed direction. Vanessa ordered tea she didn't drink and kept shredding her napkin into tiny pieces. And finally, she looked up at Jenna with eyes that were exhausted beyond anything physical rest could fix. "I wanted to thank you for taking care of Leo. Gavin showed me videos of you two at his speech therapy sessions, and the way he looks at you is how a kid should look at a parent. And I can't give him that." Jenna felt her throat get tight because this was the conversation she'd been terrified of having. "Vanessa, I'm not trying to replace you. I know you're his mom." But Vanessa shook her head hard enough that her hair fell in her face. "I'm biologically his mom, but I can't be his parent. There's a difference. I wanted to be the kind of mother who could show up every single day, but my brain doesn't work that way, and forcing it is making me sicker. He deserves someone who can be there without falling apart. That's you, not me." She pulled an envelope out of her purse and slid it across the table. "I wrote him a letter for when he's older and can understand, and I'm going to move back to California and stay connected through birthday cards and letters. I'm choosing his stability over my guilt, because that's the only good parenting decision I'm capable of making right now." Jenna took the envelope with shaking hands. "I'll make sure he knows you loved him enough to want him to be okay, even if it meant stepping back. I promise I'll take care of him." Vanessa's eyes filled up again. "I know you will. I can see it in how Gavin talks about you. Just please love my son the way I wish I could. That's all I'm asking." They sat there for a few more minutes in that coffee shop with the afternoon sun coming through the windows, making everything feel surreal. And then Vanessa left to catch her flight back to California, and Jenna sat alone with an envelope addressed to a 5-year-old, and the weight of a responsibility she'd never expected to carry. That night, Jenna and Gavin had the hardest conversation of their relationship sitting on his back porch after Leo was asleep. And Gavin asked her straight up if she was ready for what staying meant, that Vanessa stepping back permanently meant Jenna would be Leo's primary mother figure if they stayed together, that this wasn't casual dating anymore. This was building a family. "I'm terrified," Jenna admitted, and her stutter caught on the word terrified, turning it into 3 syllables. "I'm scared I'll mess him up, or not be enough, or that you'll resent me someday for not being his biological mom. But Gavin, I love him. I love both of you, and I want to stay and figure this out together if you'll let me." Gavin pulled her close enough that she could hear his heartbeat. "I'm scared too, but I'm choosing you. I'm choosing us. We're going to make mistakes, but we'll make them together, deal?" Jenna nodded against his chest. "Deal, but I need you to be patient with me while I learn how to be a parent, because I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing." Gavin laughed, and it sounded relieved. "Nobody knows what they're doing. We're all just making it up and hoping we don't break the tiny humans. You're already doing great." 5 months went by faster than Jenna thought possible, and suddenly it was February again, and she'd moved into Gavin's house after spending 3 months basically living there anyway. And her apartment in Uptown was now just a memory and a lease she didn't renew. Leo's speech therapy had progressed to the point where his therapist, Miss Amanda, was talking about graduation from the intensive program, moving him to monthly check-ins instead of twice-weekly sessions. And Leo was so proud of himself, he'd been practicing a little speech for weeks about what he'd learned. Jenna went to every single therapy session, learned all the mouth exercises and breathing techniques, practiced with Leo in the car and at bedtime, watched this kid work harder to communicate than most adults ever had to work at anything, and felt her heart grow in ways she didn't know were possible. The morning of Leo's therapy graduation, Gavin pulled Jenna aside while Leo was getting dressed, and his face had that expression he got when he was nervous about something important. So I want to celebrate Leo's milestone with you today. I want us to be there together as his parents. And I have something planned for after the ceremony, if you're okay with that. Nothing scary, I promise, just something I've been thinking about for a while now. Jenna's heart started doing complicated things because she knew that tone, had heard it enough times to recognize when Gavin was building up to something big. Okay, yeah, of course I want to celebrate with you guys. What are you planning? Gavin kissed her forehead. You'll see this afternoon. Just trust me. It's a good thing, I promise. The therapy center had decorated their main room with streamers and balloons, and there were about 8 other families there celebrating their kids' milestones. And Jenna sat between Gavin and Leo, feeling like her heart might actually burst from how proud she was of this little boy. Miss Amanda called Leo up first, and he walked to the front of the room with his shoulders back, and he delivered the speech he'd been practicing about how hard it was to make his mouth work right. But he kept trying because giving up wasn't an option, and his words weren't perfect, but they were clear and strong, and every parent in that room was crying, including Jenna, who'd given up on keeping her mascara intact about 5 minutes in. Then Leo did something they hadn't rehearsed. He looked right at Jenna and said in his careful, deliberate way, Jenna, you helped me find my words. You practiced with me every day. You never got frustrated when I couldn't say things right. Will you stay forever? The entire room went silent, and Jenna felt like someone had reached into her chest and squeezed. And then Gavin was standing up and pulling a small box out of his jacket pocket, and oh my God, this was happening right now in front of everyone. He got down on one knee right there between the folding chairs and the kid-decorated posters about speech sounds. Jenna Bishop, on our first date you asked me not to laugh at your stutter. Today I'm asking you not to run from our love. You've been Leo's mom in every way that matters for almost a year now. Will you make it official? Will you marry me and let us be your family forever? Jenna was ugly, crying so hard she couldn't get words out at all. Stutter or no stutter, and she just nodded while Leo ran over and crashed into both of them yelling, she said yes, even though she technically hadn't said anything. The whole therapy center erupted in applause, and Miss Amanda was crying and taking pictures. And Gavin slid the ring on Jenna's finger, with hands that were shaking almost as bad as hers. I love you both so much, Jenna finally managed to get out. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay forever. Yes to all of it. They had the engagement party at Gavin's house that night with Casey and Gavin's brother and a bunch of friends from Leo's preschool. And Jenna kept looking at the ring on her finger, thinking about how a year and a half ago she'd been hiding from dates and convinced she was too broken for love, and now she had a whole entire family. They got married 4 months later in June in Gavin's backyard, with white chairs set up on the grass that desperately still needed landscaping, and Leo as the ring bearer taking his job so seriously he walked slower than the actual bride. The reception was at the same coffee shop where everything had started because the owners had offered when they heard the story, cleared out the furniture for the night and strung up lights and let them have the whole place. When it was time for speeches, Jenna stood up in her simple dress with her stutter present and accounted for. I spent most of my life apologizing for the way my words came out, hiding from situations where I might stutter, believing that imperfect communication meant I was less worthy of love. She looked at Gavin and Leo sitting at the head table. These two taught me that the best conversations aren't about perfect words. They're about showing up and being honest and giving people space to communicate in whatever way works for their brain. Thank you to everyone here who's ever loved me through my broken sentences and never made me feel like I needed to be fixed. Leo jumped up from his chair before anyone could stop him and yelled at the top of his lungs, I love you, Jenna. And the words came out clear as a bell. No hesitation, no struggle, pure joy in sound form. And there wasn't a dry eye in the entire coffee shop. Sometimes the family you build is stronger than the family you're born into. Sometimes perfect words matter less than persistent love. Sometimes the person who understands your struggles best is the one fighting their own version of the same battle. Jenna asked Gavin not to laugh at her stutter, and he showed her his son who was learning that communication takes courage. Gavin asked Jenna not to run from their love, and she stayed through the hard parts and chose them every single day. If this story reminded you that you don't need perfect words to build a perfect life, that showing up imperfect and being accepted is worth more than hiding and being alone, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters exactly as it is. Thanks for being here with us. And remember, family isn't always about biology. Sometimes it's about who shows up and stays.